That put the Worldwide Wrestling Federation intros to shame, I would say.
Jordan, we're off to such a good start. Maybe we should stop right now. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, we don't want to say anything we'll regret.
You wouldn't know this, but Jordan is here in part out of friendship. He's extremely in demand, as you know. I think I caught you between California and Singapore in a weak moment, and we are the beneficiaries of that. Thanks so much for coming.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
I would also like to do, just exceptionally, I would like to mention two people of great distinction in the front row. My dear friend, Rex Murphy, and also the recent controversial and admirably outspoken winner of the Vimy Award, General Michel Maisonneuve, if you would, please. Jordan, the people have come here, quite rightly, to hear you. And as Julie said in her introduction, to many of us, you first became well known in that preposterous controversy at the University of Toronto. And I flatter us with the thought that the tide turned somewhat in your favor when completely spontaneously, in the same week, I believe, Peggy Wente, the late Christy Blatchford, Rex, and I all produced columns denouncing the cowardice and philistinism of the authorities, such as they are at the University of Toronto, for being complicit in the harassment of you over this issue of, I think it's called compelled speech, where you were supposedly required by some of your students to address them in a vocabulary they invented because of their purported sexuality. And this whole issue of free speech, my cell phone is now ringing and I will turn it off, even though it is in fact my wife, so there may be repercussions. She's in New York today. Apparently safe. It was an appalling ordeal you went through, and all of us here, I'm sure, identified with you and did what we could, as Rex and I did, to at least make our views known. But how do you feel the state of freedom of expression is in this country now, especially in the academic world? I mean, do you feel we're still sliding, or are we making a comeback? I mean, what's your view of it now? You're the center of the storm, came through it with colors flying, but how does it look to you now?
Well, I'm in touch on a regular basis with about 100 dissident academics, let's say, a number of them in Canada. There's an increasing number of people who've been pushed past the point where they can be pushed. And there are people who are slow to anger, I would say, but not pleasant once roused. And there's a lot more of them than there were 5 years ago. So that's all to the good. And I see that in Canada, in the US, and in the UK. That's really starting to gather steam and force, let's say. So the opposition is developing and organizing. So that's very helpful. I think the universities, for all intents and purposes, are done. I can't see any hope for them. Like, I've watched large organizations collapse for a variety of reasons. Over the last 20 years, I've been in a position to be communicating with people who've either shepherded them through a collapse or participated in the collapse, let's say. And large enterprises can fall apart very quickly once they start to fall apart, because a small number of people in any organization do all the work, and when the ship starts to sink, especially if it's scuttled by the people who are operating it, the competent people leave first. And there aren't that many of them, and as soon as they leave, you're done. And the universities haven't just made one fatal mistake, they've made like 7 fatal mistakes. And so I just can't see, they're still running on the glories of their past endeavors. They're like parasites in a whale carcass. That's a good way of thinking about it. And it's a good biological metaphor. And there's lots of whale left, but it'll run out soon. And I just can't see how they can possibly last. Now, I'm involved with a mortar and bricks university enterprise in Savannah, Georgia, called Ralston College. And we ran our first master's program this year trying to produce a new educational institute that would compete. But I don't think that's where the real competition will take place. So on the academic front, there's some good news, but it's mostly just catastrophic. I'm just continually embarrassed beyond belief, especially at what's happening in the scientific community now on the hard science front. I knew when the woke mob hit the scientists that they'd sink through them like a hot knife through butter, because one thing about scientists is they aren't politically prepared, and they're generally quite contemptuous of such things, and to some degree rightly so, because good scientists are hyper-specialists and they have their head down and their nose to the grindstone, and they're experts in their tiny little domain, which is exactly what they're paid for, and thank God for all that beetling away diligently. But when the ideological woke mob starts to knock at their door, they don't have the foggiest idea what to do. And so great scientific journals like Science and Nature have become woke corrupted in the last 2 years to a degree that's almost impossible to imagine. And one of the things I've really learned here is that the so-called death of God, right, that Nietzschean prophecy, Nietzsche knew that that would take out the churches and most of civil society, but it wasn't so obvious that it would take out science too, but it looks like it's going to. So none of that's good news, really. None of that's good news. Not in the let's say, in the overarching sense. I like to see the fact that people are gathering some steam in terms of pushing back, but I just can't see how the universities can maintain their hammerlock on education given what they now offer for the money. Ideological indoctrination at $150,000 per degree if you're lucky. It's just not a viable business model, let's say. To paraphrase our prime minister in relationship to liquid natural gas production, we can't make a business case for that. So.
The university system now is largely an unemployment deferral operation. Mm-hmm. At immense cost to society, as you said, we have these millions of people ostensibly studying subjects that they could not possibly earn a livelihood from when they graduate. And I think you were absolutely right, and the first person to say it, though you now have many emulators, as in many other things, that any course describing itself with the word studies is not a serious academic subject. And this is true. No one is going to make a living out of gender studies.
Except in human resources. Yeah.
But, I mean, my fear is in the United States, and I know that guy from Savannah. He's called upon, I tried to help him a bit, but it's a little impractical, I'm afraid, what he's trying to do. But the endowments of these American universities in particular are so immense, they can carry on just, living off what's been accumulated for a long time. And the loyalty of alumni to their universities, no matter how corrupted they have become, is startling to me. But I mean, as a practical matter, Jordan, we aren't going to see the university simply disappear. I mean, they won't disappear, and perhaps that's unfortunate, but you think there's no chance of an evolution in response to these signs of hope that you described? I mean, a positive evolution.
Not really. Well, the thing is that the system is so overwhelmed by people who are possessed by this quasi-religious ideology that I can't see practically how that can be altered. People, once they're in a university, are there pretty permanently. And the younger the people are in the university, the administrators and the faculty, let's say, the longer their tenure, and the overwhelming majority of them now are not only woke by temperamental proclivity, but woke by selection practice. So, you know, I don't know if you know this, but it's a good thing to know. So before scientists are hired in the University of California system, which for a long time was an outstanding public education system, say what you want about places like Berkeley. I mean, the University of California system was a shining star. Now, before you can have so when you're hired as a scientist, it used to be a pretty cut and dried procedure in some real sense to be hired as a research scientist at a university. The only thing that mattered was how many publications you'd managed to produce in journals, scientific journals in your specialty, and the journals were pretty much rank ordered in terms of quality using quantitative metrics. And so the higher the status of the journal, the more attention your publication would receive from your peers, the more additional research it would generate. It's a pretty good measure of the impact and the practical significance of your research. Insofar as those things can be quantified, it was quite well quantified. And so essentially what you did if you were a young researcher was send out you worked like a mad dog in graduate school. Hopefully you had a good supervisor. You produced somewhere between 2 and 8 publications. If you were really pushing the envelope, it would be up at 8. You'd have a couple of those in high impact, well-recognized journals, some of them specific to your area, and then some of them influential enough to be multidisciplinary, a few rare journals like that. A selection committee would take a look at your resume. They'd rank order the candidates by publication quality, and they'd peel from the top. And that was a pretty damn good system. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't perfect in part because it didn't do a great job of selecting for teaching prowess. But that wasn't the fundamental purpose of research institutes, at least so they thought. But all things considered, it was a pretty strict merit-based system, and it worked very well in the University of California system, for example. Well, now 75% of the dossiers of junior scientists are not even considered, they're rejected out of hand because the diversity, inclusivity, and equity statement is not sufficiently well developed, whatever the hell that means, to allow them to pass muster. And if you want to get some sense of exactly the state of your benighted country, and mine as well, you could go online and read the frequently asked questions for the submission of your diversity, inclusivity, and equity statement for researchers who are applying, let's say, for grants in Canada. And you'll find a policy that basically states, no matter what you've done on the diversity, inclusivity, and equity front in the past, no matter how stellar your performance in adhering to this ideological idiocy, don't be thinking for a moment that you've done enough. And you can't just tell us how you've already kowtowed sufficiently so that we'll provide you with money. You have to explain in detail not only how you're going to follow the rules as they are already laid out, but how you're going to adapt to any rules that we might impose on you at any point in the future. And if you think that's an exaggeration, you go read the frequently asked questions yourself. You couldn't write a more Orwellian document if you got a committee of Ottawa bureaucrats together to write it, which is exactly what happened. It was plenty Orwellian. And so, you know, if you can destroy the University of California system in relationship to the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, you can do that in 5 years, which is pretty much what's happened. I don't think there's a hell of a lot of hope for the universities. If you can subvert the entire grant process in Canada to an ideology that purports to claim on moral grounds that the way that you should rank order scientists is by their skin color, their sex, and their gender, there is no bottom to how corrupt and perverse the universities can become. So no, I'm not particularly optimistic on that front. So, and don't be thinking the scientists are going to save you, because they're going to fold a hell of a lot faster than the people in the humanities folded, because they're nowhere near as prepared for the political battle. Let's put it that way. So no, I'm not optimistic. It's pretty bloody appalling as far as I can tell.
Jordan, I did not, by my question, I did not mean to imply that I was optimistic about the university. It just seems to me that they've got this mighty gravy train that they've amassed over decades, and they will plod on, but other than in the learned professions where it's hard to do without them altogether, it seems to me their significance and influence will steadily decline, and economic factors are going to put immense pressure on the faddishness that they're selling. We see it now with all the nonsense about accommodations of climate change and going to sustainable energy that nobody can afford. But, and by the way, I agree with you about the scientists. I made the horrifying mistake a couple of weeks ago of seeking out and reading an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I mean, I'd never read such bunk in my life. But anyway, my brief here is to keep us somewhat on the track of rights, status of rights, liberties, how are we doing on that front? And in some respects, what you have predicted, I don't doubt accurately, of a decline of the universities. And as their influence declines, their morale will decline. They'll just become a kind of infestation. That isn't all bad in terms of what happens to our liberties. The influence of the universities will decline as their strength and morale and vigor decline, I think. I mean, am I talking rubbish? I mean, I'm trying to find, I admit I'm not an optimist, but I'm trying to find some potential wellspring of future optimism.
Well, there are all sorts of alternatives springing up on the potential horizon. I mean, it's definitely the case. Now, it's not easy to duplicate a university online. Now, various attempts have been made to do this, and they usually suffer from the delusion that a university is primarily lectures, exams, and accreditation. So I suppose if you had to extract out three things that universities do, those might be the most obvious. But you should never, I read a great book a long while ago when I was a kid called Systemantics, and one of the maxims of this book, John Gall wrote it, was the system does not do what its name says it does. And that's a lovely thing to keep in the back of your mind. And it isn't obvious what universities do. You know, they provide, well, so why pay $150,000 to go to university? Well, how about to find a wife or a husband? Right? That might, just that alone, because you have a select pool then of people who are roughly your, say, intellectual and social peers. The universities for a long time did a pretty good job of screening applicants, and so it might be worth $150,000 in 4 years if one of the things you accomplish between the ages of 18 and 22 is you meet the person you're going to spend the rest of your life with. That's a big deal. Well, it gives you 4 years to mature. It gives you 4 years to learn how to be independent. It gives you 4 years. It allows you to purchase a socially sanctioned identity for 4 years that you have to make some sacrifices to maintain. Let's say you have to go to class and study, but while you're doing that, you can actually think a little bit, you can learn to be a citizen, you can contemplate your future, you can experiment, and you can all do that while you're becoming more mature and independent and looking for a partner. And the universities do provide all of that, and you know, God only knows, maybe that's enough even without the classes. It's not easy to duplicate that online. Having said that, the possibilities for technology-mediated education are so vast now that they're almost incalculable. And the technology that enables education to proceed is developing at an unbelievably rapid rate. And so it's certainly possible that alternatives to the technical education system that we have now are going to pop up very, very quickly and very effectively. I mean, I'm involved. My daughter and I primarily at the moment are working on an enterprise called Perterson Academy, and we have 30 professors already signed up and have recorded a number of courses. We think we can drive the cost of a Bachelor of Education, a Bachelor of Arts, that's our first target. We figure we can drive the cost of that down to $4,000. She thinks we can do it for half that. So now, you know, that sort of that's premature applause, because that's a hell of a lot easier said than done. But I don't think it's impossible, and I think the universities are doing such a spectacularly terrible job, especially at providing education in the humanities now, that you wouldn't have to put together that credible an alternative to be able to cut them off at the knees, and that's basically the plan. And so I'm not pessimistic in terms of what the world has to offer on the front of general mass education. I think we have opportunities there that have never been available to people in the entire course of history. I mean, even on the podcast front, let's say, it's become pretty clear to me that the audience of people who can watch and listen is probably 10 times as big as the audience that can or will read. And so that's quite the multiplying factor. And it's certainly the case now that it's far easier for many people to do a 3-hour lecture or a series of 3-hour lectures on YouTube and publish that instantly at 0 cost and reach far more people than they'd ever reach with a book. And this is not to say that I have anything against books, because books make you think rigorously for a long period of time. But man, well, and look what Pierre Poilievre did in the last, when he ran for the Conservative leadership. I mean, he just walked around the legacy media and just spoke directly to people online, essentially, and that worked like a charm. And so there's lots of technologies that are sitting there waiting to be utilized intelligently to give the universities a run for their money.
But keeping my nose to this grindstone of the matter of rights and liberties, and not trying to lead the witness, am I right then that in saying that the decline of the university actually in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of thought formation is a good thing, because they lose their monopoly or quasi-monopoly. There is this, if I may use the word in a sensible way, diversification, and the power of the restrictionist and authoritarian dogmatists of the universities declines, and the freedom of society actually might benefit from that. Or am I being too hopeful?
Well, we'll see. We'll see. You know, I mean.
No, but you're the sage here. What do you think is going to happen?
What do I think is going to happen?
On that side.
I think things will probably get a hell of a lot worse on the university front before they get better. That'd be my guess. I mean, I can't really see. I figure a third of the universities will go broke in the next 5 years. I just can't see how they can't. I think they can't. I can't see how that can't happen.
So we have a kind of St. Vitus dance in the universities, and then it's like a revolution, you know, like the French Revolution. We get the reign of terror before we get Thermidor. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that seems to be happening too, although the evidence on this is mixed, is, you know, increasingly universities, especially on the arts side of the spectrum, let's say, are dominated by females. It's about 2 to 1 in many places now. It turns out that the women stop attending once the ratio falls below 2 to 1. And unsurprisingly, because, as I said, part of the reason that universities exist is so that young people can go off and find a viable mate. And if that function has been decimated, and it's already been decimated, because the picture's actually more dreadful than you'd expect just looking at the 2 to 1 ratio. Because it doesn't mean there's 2 girls for every guy like the Beach Boys song. It means that the pool of eligible men has shrunk to almost non-existent, and, well, the pool of desperate men has remained the same. And that's technically true, and this is very frustrating for young women. And so the men are starting to bail out of the universities like mad, and that's been happening really over about a 20-year period. But when the boys leave, the girls will leave too, so it'll just take longer. So now, will that be a net benefit in terms of freedom of speech? I don't know. Things are so unstable right now and changing so rapidly. I can't really claim to see more than about 6 months to a year ahead at most. I mean, not only because things are so stable and strange politically, but there are things, and everyone in the audience should know this, there are things coming down the pipeline on the artificial intelligence front that are just going to make your hair stand on end within the next year, because there is so much transformation going on in that domain. And that's been the case particularly for the last 6 months, that it's almost unimaginable. You're going to see things you just can't possibly. How many of you clap? How many of you know what ChatGPT is? Okay. So not very many. So I'll tell you what ChatGPT is, just so you know, because you need to know this. And I don't know what sort of technological revolution this is. Gutenberg press level? It's something like that. This is a big deal. So this AI system, it's a general language processing model, was released about a week and a half ago. And I went and interacted with it. It's an AI system, artificial intelligence system. It basically is trained on, well, a massive corpus of spoken or of text. So it's derived its models of the world from the analysis of human speech, essentially. It isn't using real world data yet, but that will be happening certainly within the next year. So, and ChatGPT analyzes a very large corpus of text, and that corpus is growing all the time. Now, it's already sophisticated enough. I went on to it last week, and I said, okay, some of you know I've written these books, 12 Rules for Life, and then Beyond Order, 12 more rules, because, you know, you can't have enough rules. And I asked it, this is what I asked it to do. I said, write me an essay that's a 13th rule for Beyond Order, written in a style that combines the King James Bible with the Tao Te Ching. That's pretty difficult to pull off, you know. Any one of those things is hard. The intersection of all three, that's impossible. Well, it wrote it in about 3 seconds, 4 pages long, and it isn't obvious to me, for better or worse, that I would be able to tell that I didn't write it. Right, and okay, and that's pretty impressive, although, you know, maybe not its relationship to what I've written, but the fact that it could do that grammatically perfectly, right? And quite impressive philosophically. I also had it write an essay on the intersection between the Taoist version of ethical morality and the ethics that are outlined in the Sermon on the Mount, which it just nailed, got that dead right, brilliant. Again, it took it about 3 seconds. There was a computer engineer who purported to work for Tesla. He asked ChatGPT, he said, look, I work for Elon Musk, but I haven't been doing much for the last week, so I need you to write me 10 bullet points about what I probably would have done as a engineer at Twitter. What 10 things did I do last week that were productive and valuable? And, oh, if you don't mind, write me the accompanying computer code that goes with each project. And it did that too, 3 seconds, and the computer code works. Right, and so, okay, so that's already there. So then a university professor did this. He thought, oh, that's interesting. Any student will be able to write any essay on any topic with ChatGPT. And someone gave it an SAT, by the way, and it scored about as well as the average student in a well-functioning public university. So that's how smart it is. So that's basically an IQ test. He said, write me an essay, gave it a topic, wrote the essay. He said, now grade it. He said, if we can automate the students, we should be able to automate the professors too. And so it provided a complete, comprehensive analysis of its own essay with grade. It wrote, someone else asked it, write the screenplay and describe the characters for the next $900 million Hollywood blockbuster. It's like, bang, plot, characterizations. Then someone else took the descriptions of the actors and said, generate photorealistic computer images for each actor. And all the AI systems could do that. So I'm going to tell you what's going to happen next. This is going to happen this year. So get ready. Okay, so now we have an AI model that can extract a model of the world from the entire corpus of language. All right, and it's smarter than you. And it's going to be a hell of a lot smarter than you in 2 years. So you can get ready for that too. But it's not that smart yet because it's just a humanities professor at the moment. It doesn't test its linguistic knowledge against the real world. That's what a scientist does, right? You come up with a theory that's linguistically predicated, and then you throw it against the world and see if it sticks. And then the world tells you whether or not your linguistic construction is valid. But the new AI systems will be able to extract out patterns from the world itself, from images and so forth, and then be able to test their linguistic constructions against the world, and so they'll practice just like scientists. And the most advanced models are going to use text and image and action as well, because they'll be able to model human action. And so, and all of that's going to come down the pipes within the next year. So hang on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen, because what did my friend Jonathan Pajot say? Giants are going to walk the earth once more. And we're going to live through that, maybe. So, anyways.
In terms of our rights, though,
yeah.
that is not a bad development.
Well, we'll see. I mean, Elon Musk, one of the things he's working on, he thinks that the world will be controlled by whoever produces the most functional AI system the fastest, because there'll be a first mover advantage. And one of the things Musk has been working on for a long time are distributed AI systems, so that you'll have your own artificial intelligence to protect you against, well, let's say against Google's artificial intelligence, for starters. Yeah, or the CCP's artificial intelligence, because you can bet your hat they're working on that about as fast as they possibly can. So,
let me ask you about the aspects of the internet. I mean, you, despite the persecution you've endured, you've had an enormous internet following. You went viral a long time ago and have stayed there. And
yeah, I'm worse than the pandemic.
We touched upon this earlier in the green room, but we have this unusual situation where we have contemplated legislation or regulatory changes in this country where the government, the federal government, thinks it can have a form of registration of content providers. And I suspect what they're doing is trying to catch the coattails of this reaction in the United States to the revelations, which are no great surprise to anyone who followed it, of the extreme partisanship and professional dishonesty of the major social media platforms in political terms. But what is your advice to this country and to this group about preservation of freedom of expression in the internet? I mean, you have been a great benefactor to all of us, but in your chosen mission, a beneficiary of a relatively free access. In an exchange of emails we had a couple of weeks ago, you expressed concern that a poll had revealed that 75% of Canadians would cheerfully and uncomplainingly go back to wearing masks and a shutdown if they were told by the ostensible authorities to do so, even though we now know that all of these people, all of Fauci's local emulators, they all self-identify as Dr. Frankenstein's monsters. And but my question of you is, can we preserve freedom on the internet?
Well, I think we have a blessing in disguise in the Liberal government, because they're too incompetent to be as tyrannical as they want to be. And so, you know, I'd probably match your typical dim-witted gaming 13-year-old boy against Trudeau's best bureaucrats on the tech front any day. And so it's not going to be that easy to lock down the net. And the other thing that'll happen too, and perhaps you should get prepared for this, is that anybody in Canada who's got a creative bone in their body, once they're subject to the kind of limitations that the Trudeau government is trying to put on content providers, which is anyone, by the way, you're a content provider, man, if you post on Facebook, and some of you probably do, even though maybe you shouldn't. All they'll do is all the creative people just leave. Like it's like, we're not putting up with that. See you later. We got bigger fish to fry elsewhere. And then there's all sorts of ways of circumventing the kind of what would you call manipulations that the Canadian government wants to impose. So although I think it's appalling, and I think that expert users will just circumvent the idiocy. But, so I was in Australia for most of the last month, and that was quite entertaining. And they're not quite as crazy as Canadians, but they're trying hard. I was there with my mother, and she's about 85, and my aunt, elderly people, and they're kind of nonplussed about what's going on around me and what's going on in the world. And my mom asked a rather plaintive question. She said, where should I get my news? She said, how do you keep yourself informed, and where should I get my news? And I thought, well, there's no way, Mom, I can teach you to do what I do, because well, not that I would want to either, but I'm informing myself with multiple news sources constantly, and it's very, very difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff, and it isn't even obvious to me that I'm always doing that great a job of it. She hasn't got a hope in hell of doing that. No, I mean it. She just doesn't have a hope. It's like my mom and anybody who's over 50, basically, I would say, grew up in a world where your access to necessary information was gated by relatively reliable filtering hierarchies, like relatively reliable. So publishing companies were relatively reliable, and there was a number of them. So you could pick, you weren't subject to only one. You could listen to CBC, and most of the time you got something that approximated the news. And if that didn't work, well, you had CTV, and if that didn't work, you had the major American broadcasters. And you had Time magazine and Newsweek and The Economist, which is still a relatively intact magazine. And, you could find your way. But that's because you could trust the people who were providing you with information. Well, now you can't. And so what the hell are people supposed to do? Now the expert users, the government's never going to keep up with them because they don't have the flexibility. But for the typical Canadian, this legislation will really affect them. It'll be a priori censoring, and the government wants to have control over the search engine strategies. I mean, that's everything, the search engine strategies. That's the gateway into the world of information itself. And so it's not good.
Is that this deliverability thing where they want to, I'm getting out of my depth here, but where they want to alter the logarithm of discoverability?
Yeah, the algorithms, yeah. Well, so an algorithm is an automated process for, let's say, rank ordering information in a given way. And the thing about Google, for example, Google really controls what you see because you never look past the first page on the search. And when Google's motto was, what was it? Don't be evil. Yeah, don't be evil, which they scrapped, in case you haven't noticed. We don't know how they rank order their searches. And so what that means is you don't know what filtering mechanisms determine what hits your field of vision first. And you could easily say the person who controls the information filtering mechanism has a hammerlock on your capacity for attention. And there isn't much difference between that and your consciousness itself. Like, it's a big deal. And it is exactly the control of the algorithm, or at least in part the control of the algorithm, that is being fought over in relationship to this legislation. And it's dreadful. It's a dreadful thing. It won't affect the expert users. They'll just bypass it. But ordinary Canadians, you see this too, like, you might ask yourself, for example, I think I read a poll a while back, said 70% of Canadians still think, I think it was 70%, still think Trudeau's the right man for the job compared to the alternatives. And you think, how the hell can people think that? And, well, I've really tried to think that through, because my sense of it is that the Trudeau government has admired itself in at least 15 scandals of sufficient magnitude so that during the course of 80% of my life, any one of them would have resulted in the dissolution of Parliament. And yet it's just like one absolutely preposterous, cataclysmic catastrophe after another with no effect. I mean, nothing happened as a consequence of the investigation into the trucker convoy, for example. Nothing happened when Trudeau locked down people's bank accounts. And so then you got to ask yourself, well, Well, why is this? Why is this? Are Canadians really so blind? And I don't think that's exactly the right way of looking at it. It's the whale carcass problem again. For 150 years, the default rule in Canada, and this is the great rule for civil, productive, and generous societies, is trust. You could trust. You could trust the government, you know, not 100%, but about as much as you could trust another institution, let's say. And so basically you could trust them. You could trust the media, you could trust higher education, all of that. And that's wealth, right? That's wealth. Trust. And now you can't. And so Canadians are in a terrible position, especially, I would say, especially older Canadians. They can either assume that things have gone seriously sideways in a way that's almost incalculable, or that all the concern about such things is nothing but conspiratorial idiocy of the sort, say, that drove the trucker convoy, right? And to fall for the notion that these were misogynist, racist bigots who were conspiring. I used to tell people this in the United States. I go to the United States, it didn't matter whether I was talking to Democrats or Republicans, I would say, here, I'm going to tell you what our Prime Minister told his people. Are you ready for this? Democrats even. It's like, the trucker convoy was financed by Make America Great Again Republicans who wanted to destabilize Canada's democracy. And they look at me like I had to be a tin-hatted right-wing conspiratorial theorist, because no one in their right mind would ever entertain for a second any notion that preposterous. It's, first of all, most Republicans don't know where Canada is. Okay, and I mean that. It's like, we're just not on their radar. It's like, and second, so maybe we're north of them somewhere, by New York, maybe. Or south, like Mexico, where they speak Mexican. And, and even if they do know where we are, which they don't care, because they don't have to. And so no, they're not interested enough to fund the trucker convoy, that's for sure. And then to add another level of preposterousness, it's like, okay, so the Republicans want to destabilize Canada's democracy. It's like, well, why? Well, then I could explain to the Americans, we didn't actually need a reason. We just assumed that's what they were up to. It's like, well, why would they want that? Why would a Republican, a Make America Great Again Republican, want to destabilize Canada's democracy? It's like, even if they cared, which they don't. So we have a government that actually said that to its people, right? And then, you know, I went on Twitter after the Emergencies Act was lifted, because I went on it. I read like 10,000 tweets when Trudeau put in the Emergency Act, looking at the Trudeau supporters, and they bought this Make America Great Again democracy destabilization story. I thought, okay, you people are clearly out of your minds. But then I went on again after Trudeau lifted the Emergencies Act to think, okay, now what are they going to make of this? And here was the story. The story was, well, despite the tremendous threat that Make America Great Again, Trump-loving Republicans had posed to the integrity of Canadian democracy, our Prime Minister acted so forthrightly that it only took him 3 days to quell the danger. It's like, okay, good one, guys. That's quite the feat of mental gymnastics, but what's the alternative, eh? What's the alternative? You're going to believe all of a sudden, after trusting in your country for 160 years, that you have a government that's so incompetent and so malevolent and so corrupt and so juvenile that they think that stealing Canadians' bank accounts is a reasonable way of responding to working class people when they get sick and tired of being locked down by idiots for 2 years? So Canadians default, and partly because they're not very well informed, and partly because information's hard to find. They default to the trust that's enabled us to build the country that we have built, and it's not that surprising, but it's pretty damn sad. And it doesn't, What do we now? We make 40% less on average than Americans, eh?
Yes.
Yeah, 40%, man. That's quite the bloody catastrophe
And
over 20 years.
30% less than the Republic of Ireland, which when I first went there 60 years ago was a very poor country.
Right, right.
And it has no resources.
Right?
No,
right.
It's a scandalously uncompetitive performance.
Well, we can do worse. We can do worse, and we certainly will. We absolutely
thought.
will.
But
No, it wouldn't surprise me at all if within 5 years we're at 40% of the U.S., especially if they get their act back together, especially if we keep doing what we're doing on the energy front.
And in that time, we will be passed by South Korea, Israel, the Czechs, and a lot of other people.
Yeah.
They're just swarming past us.
Yeah.
When I was young, we were the second richest country in the world. Even if you leave the petro states and the tax haven states out of it, we're only about 20th now, and competitively speaking, sinking all the time. Look,
yeah, and by necessity on the policy front, because part of what drives the insane green woke agenda is the claim that, and Nature, this once great science magazine, one of the world's top 2 science journals, just published an article this week, Scientists for Degrowth. So what's degrowth? Well, here's the proposition. There's no way the planet can sustain the number of people it has on it at anywhere near the level of prosperity that those privileged to be in the West have managed in the last 30 years, let's say. And so, those of us in the West, except for consultants, are going to have to tighten their belts and, suck that gut in a few notches. Now, that'll mean that people in the developing world can put the bloody belt around their neck and tighten it until it's the noose that kills them, but it doesn't really matter because there's too many people on the planet anyways. And so this degrowth philosophy that's driving Canadians into penury, especially poor Canadians, isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's driven by this agenda that assumes that we're yeast in a petri dish and that we'll keep on multiplying insanely and parasitically until there's so many children on the planet that every animal is going to go extinct, and we better put limits to growth on as fast as possible. Stop doing things like flying around the world or owning private automobiles or heating our houses in the winter, which they're having a hell of a time doing in the UK at the moment. It's like you can just forget about all that. And so it isn't only that we're going to be poor, it's that we bloody well better be poor because it's a moral crime to be otherwise. The whole damn planet's at stake, which is an absolutely preposterous pack of lies that's so corrupt that it's almost incomprehensible. It's so fun too, because you get all these incompetent government policies, produced, say, by our Prime Minister, who isn't really interested in monetary policy. Yeah, you can say that again. And so the failures on the economic front can be justified morally. It's like, well, yeah, the economy is collapsing, but it has to collapse because if it kept growing, we would just threaten the planet. And here's what strikes me as particularly horrifying about this. See, imagine that the woke environmentalist utopian types had their metrics right, just for the sake of argument. Imagine that they were right about carbon, and they're not, but let's just say they are. And let's imagine that their goal is actually to produce a greener and healthier and more biologically sustainable planet. And they had their metrics in place. Well, that'd be fine. That'd be fine, at least in principle. But the truth of the matter is that by following this insane utopian green woke agenda, Germany, for example, has managed to make its electricity 5 times as expensive as it used to be, and they've now fallen to like 167th in the world in terms of the amount of pollution produced per unit of energy. So all that wind power, which actually doesn't work very well when the wind isn't blowing, like it hasn't been for the last 3 weeks during this cold snap that's enveloped Europe, it's just meant there's more coal plants than there were in Germany when they started this whole bloody green revolution. And so here's what's going to happen if we don't get our act together, and we probably won't, but if we don't, we're going to make everyone poor, and we're going to destroy the bloody planet while doing so. And I would say, in my darker moments, I think that's the plan, because there's an antithetical sentiment in relationship to human beings at the bottom of this woke nonsense that's so goddamn deep and perverse that it's positively genocidal in its aim. And you might think, well, hold on there, Dr. Peterson. It's like, yeah, how many times has someone said to you, yeah, but the planet has too many people on it anyways? You have to, first of all, that isn't a person saying that, okay? I'm dead serious about this. That is not a person who's saying that to you. That person is the unwitting or witting mouthpiece of a system of unbelievably pathological and destructive ideas. And those ideas do not have your best interests in mind. So,
Jordan, in my own view, which I've often stated, is that with the talented improvisation that nobody would have suspected, when the international left was defeated in the Cold War, they crowded aboard the environmental bandwagon, jostled aside the authentic ecologists, the bird watchers and the butterfly collectors, and these sincere, somewhat tedious groups like Greenpeace and Sierra and so on, and dressed themselves up as environmentalists to attack capitalism from a new angle in the name of saving the planet. And it was a genius, spontaneous strategy. But they've got more than they bargained for, because now they're really pitching, as you say, for the suicide of everybody, including the left. But, and we're not all going to commit suicide, in my opinion, but I agree, it's as parlous as you described. But what I want to ask you is that how, in the scenario you described, and I certainly wouldn't take issue with it, where the government in this country, and no doubt others, attempts to regulate content and so forth on the internet, and they are outsmarted by the smartest people, easily outsmarted, because they are idiots as well as being debased people for the most part. Who wins the hearts and minds of the, to use Mr. Nixon's phrase, the silent majority of decent, sensible people? Because they're still there, no matter how deserved they are. Who wins?
well, I've been working with a group of people in the UK, and we'll announce this sooner or later, and probably sooner rather than later, on trying to formulate an alternative vision. You know, because one of the things, you have to hand it to the radicals on the left. They're pretty damn good at appealing to the messianic urges of young people. And there's a developmental psychologist, Jean Piaget, who was a stage theorist, very influential developmental psychologist, and he regarded the last stage of cognitive moral development in human beings as the messianic stage. And hardly anybody talks about that element of his research, which, because it makes religious illusions, let's say, and we can't have that. And so, but what Piaget was pointing out was that among relatively intellectually and perhaps morally sophisticated young people at about the ages of, say, 17 to 21, about the time you really want to induct young men into the army if you want to do it effectively, because, you know, if you wait longer than that, it doesn't work very well. That's about between 16, 21, something like that. That's when young people catalyze their adult identities. I suspect most of you probably like the music you listened to when you were 16 to 21 better than any other kind of music. That's a good example of that enculturation. In any case, young people who have a bit of intellectual capacity at that time are looking for something beyond themselves to devote themselves to. And some of that would be what drives their identification with in principle, their family and their community and their state and their nation, right? It's part of that drive that enables human beings to aggregate cooperatively and competitively within tribes. It's deeply rooted biological instinct. And the left has been unbelievably good at providing that impulse with a vision. And the vision is one of heroic defender of the individual against the oppressive patriarchy. It's a very old story, right? That's the hero who stands against the brute force of blind culture. It's an ancient story and a very motivating one. And if that's not enough for you, and perhaps it is, then you can be defender of the virginal planet from the rapers and pillagers, and that's where the capitalists fit in so nicely. And that's a pretty easy story to sell to young people who are looking for a mission. And it's got a quasi-religious element to it, which is deep. And so it fits in nicely to the slot that Christianity used to occupy, let's say. And so young people they fall into that by droves. Well, why? Well, it's because centrist liberals and conservatives, particularly conservatives, have done an absolutely abysmal job at formulating a counter narrative of any potency. And conservatives, they tend to be more detail-oriented and practical, and so as visionaries, they're a lost cause, and that's part of what makes them conservative. I mean that temperamentally, because people who are more on the liberal side tend to be also people who are more imaginative and creative. On the conservative side, the moral advantage to conservatives is that they're practical, detail-oriented, orderly, industrious, patriotic, all of that, but that's not the same as visionary. And so they do a terrible job of selling tradition, let's say, to young people. It's usually in the form of finger wagging and, moral injunctions about how you should never do anything that's any fun. And that's just not, or anything that's particularly heroic. Anyways, we've been trying to formulate something that you might regard as a counter vision, and I can tell you some of the policies that we're pursuing, just so you know, and we'll make this broadly public sooner or later. So the first is on the energy front. It's like, you want to help the poor? Then make energy cheap. Period. You don't get to sacrifice the actual poor to the delusional poor of your delusional utopia 100 years from now. We did that a couple of times in the 20th century. Didn't work out very well. And so you can produce all the bloody renewables you want, and more power to you, but you can do that within the confines of a free market system, and you can do that by making them cost competitive, or you can get the hell out of the way. And so you might say, well, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative, and we already know this, is extremely expensive and unreliable energy sources that are at least equally as damaging to the ecosphere, and that certainly are expensive enough to drive the vast majority of people who are barely clinging to the edge of economic viability into abject poverty. And so, enough of that. There's nothing you can say on that front that's moral. If your goal is to drive up energy prices, you're not going to save the planet, and you're going to kill maybe millions of people. If you really got your act together, you could probably kill hundreds of millions. I think the World Bank has already estimated that we've tapped something like 150 million people into near starvation conditions. And we could really get moving on that front if we keep mucking about. So the next thing to do, if we really want to be stupid, is to knock liquid natural gas availability in Europe off kilter badly enough, and maybe Putin will give us a hand with this so that we can no longer produce ammonia fertilizer, because ammonia fertilizer feeds 4 billion people, and it's derived from natural gas. So that's policy one. Cheap energy. We can ameliorate absolute poverty with cheap energy, right? Throughout the world. We have no right whatsoever in the colonial West to tell people in the developing world that they shouldn't be aspiring to standards of living like ours, to be able to heat their houses without choking on the fumes, to provide their children with rudimentary access to educational opportunities. We have no right whatsoever to say, you guys, you just stick with your bloody dung and your wood. You don't get liquid natural gas or coal or any of the things that we use to elevate ourselves out of freezing in the dark. So that's policy one. Policy two is something approximating a multifactorial environmental vision. It's like, why did we all decide in a fit of stupidity the only thing we had to worry about on the environmental front was an excess of carbon? It's like we're going to take a multifactorial problem, because there are environmental problems, and we're going to reduce it to one thing. I don't know how many of you know this. Maybe you could clap again. Do you know, how many of you know, let's do this. How many of you think the world has less vegetation in it than it did 15 years ago? How many of you think that? Come on, admit it. Okay, so How many of you know that the planet is actually 15% greener than it was in the year 2000? Oh, you do? Okay. How many of you know that that's a direct consequence of carbon dioxide production? Okay. How many of you know, this is what's really comical, how many of you know that most of that greening has occurred in the semi-arid areas that were supposed to turn into desert? Yeah, right. So, you know, we could, oh, very funny. Yeah, right. Fossil future with Alex Epstein, yeah. So we could produce an intelligent environmental policy that would be something like, well, we need to develop a vision that takes the necessity for human economic development into account and makes it primary. So the goal would be more for everyone, including our children, in a way that is as efficient and clean, whatever that means, as possible. That's fine. There are sophisticated people working on such visions. Bjorn Lomborg's a great one. I like Alec Epstein a lot. Michael Schellenberger is reliable. Marion Tupy, the Cato Institute, he knows what he's talking about. These are people who have a vision of a planet where there's more than enough for everyone, and that's within our grasp. That is definitely within our grasp. If we wanted that, we could obliterate, we're already doing a pretty good job on that front, as it turns out, but we could obliterate absolute poverty for sure in 15 years. And we also know, and this is so cool, and one of the things that shocked me when I first started to look into this, so imagine you do want a more sustainable planet. Okay, fair enough. Do you want poor people on that planet, or do you want rich people on the planet? Well, it turns out if you can get people's income up to $5,000 per year on a GDP basis, they immediately start taking a long-term view. Well, why? Well, how about because they're not scrabbling around in the dirt trying to figure out where the hell lunch is coming from, right? They can start thinking about the beauty of the local environment and the possibility that something attractive could be maintained for their children and grandchildren who are likely to live to see it. And so there's a very strong positive correlation between environmental sensitivity and wealth. So I found that out about 10 years ago. I thought, well, doesn't that mean we could have our cake and eat it too? We could work diligently to ameliorate absolute poverty around the world by driving energy costs down to as close to zero as possible. We could make everyone rich in terms of their local standards of living and the opportunities they have for their kids, and we could make the planet better off. Well, why wouldn't you want that? And the answer is, the planet has too many people on it anyways. And so, I can't overstretch how deadly the anti-humanism at the bottom of that sentiment truly is. It's pathological beyond comprehension. So, there's two more. I'll go over them very quickly. This is the toughest pill to swallow, but perhaps not for those of you in the audience. I spent a lot of time in Hungary recently, and I know that's all fascists and Nazis, but I met with the president of Hungary, who I liked very much, Katalin Novaks, and she was one of the spearheaders of the Hungarian family policy, and they spend 6% of their GDP on family support. And not in a socialist way, let's say. So how do you do that? Well, here's what they do in Hungary. If you're a married woman in Hungary and you have a child, you are now exempt from 25% of state income tax for the rest of your life. 50% with 2 kids, 75% with 3, and with 4 kids, you never pay a cent of income tax again in the rest of your life. And so, yeah, and so I thought, well, that's cool. The feminists must be celebrating that like mad all across Western Europe. And of course, their response is, you're just trying to turn women into baby-making machines. It's like, hey, I thought what you guys wanted for the last 300 years was for a society to become sophisticated enough to monetize the disproportionate female contribution to reproduction. That's kind of like the core dream of the genuine feminist. It truly is, right? Because you could say, I mean, with some degree of accuracy, that women bear a disproportionate cost for reproduction. What is a woman? A woman is the sex that bears the disproportionate cost for reproduction. And that's even biologically true. It's biologically true. And so this is a lovely solution. And so the Hungarians have, with their family support policies, which are much more extensive than that which I just laid out, they've cut the abortion rate by 40% in 10 years. It's still legal, and they did it without compulsion. So that's, unless you're the sort of person to get your sister an abortion as a Christmas present, you might think that that's actually a very positive move forward, right? Because who the hell thinks that's a good thing? You might think it should be legal and you might think it should be available, but there's really something wrong with you if you think it's good. And so to cut it by 38%, which is what they've done, that's quite the stellar accomplishment. They've also simultaneously increased female work participation by 13%. So not only have they freed women from the onerous burden of excess taxation, but they've increased the number of women who are participating in the labor force. It's like, what the hell's wrong with that? So one of the policies we're going to put forward is unabashed support, and I think the psychological literature bears me out on this. We know perfectly well that the minimum viable domestic unit for the nurturing of healthy children is a man and a woman. Now, maybe 2 adults could substitute for that, conceivably, but when you bring it down to 1, you're pushing your damn luck. It's too complicated to raise children. You can't do it optimally with one person. Some people struggle mightily and sort of manage it, but it's not an ideal and it's not optimal. And fatherlessness, I'll tell you a couple of things about fatherlessness. If you're a 12-year-old boy and you don't have a father, the telomeres on the end of your chromosomes are already 10 to 12% shorter. That means you will already die sooner, because telomere length is one of the things that predicts lifespan. And so we don't know why. It probably has something to do with some poorly understood relationship between chronic stress and chromosomal health. No one knows why. If you're a female and you don't have a father, you hit puberty at least 1 year earlier. And nobody knows why that is either. And that's not good, right? You don't want your 8-year-old hitting puberty. She's not ready for it. And the probability that that's the case is much higher if she doesn't have a father in the house. And we know that fatherlessness is associated with a catastrophic cavalcade of developmental problems. And so it's time for conservatives and centrist liberal types to say, look, we got to be tolerant. Every family that you've ever met has its problems. Nobody lives up to the ideal of long-term, faithful, loving, peaceful, productive, generous, heterosexual monogamy. Like, it's an impossible ideal, right? You're going to fight with your wife even if you stay with her, and you're not always going to be happy, that's for sure. And probably you have divorced people in your family, you know. Maybe there's a gay guy or 2 in the woodpile, who knows? And so we need to tolerate the fringes, let's say, because we're all imperfect, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't celebrate the ideal. And we got to stop being like half-witted and cowardly about this and do it forthrightly. So
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but can I just ask you this as a don't shoot the messenger. Can you, I'm seeking a little hope here. I gathered from previous remarks and exchanges we've had before that you think we've in this country become, and not only in this country, a terribly compliant and submissive to authority, no matter how absurd and malevolent it is. And that statistic, that poll you cited about 75% of people being ready to plunge back into COVID lockouts is illustrative of that. Can you see any hope in all this? I mean, with all the forces that are interacting and the trends that are emerging, you at least grasping the best I can the optimistic side of things. There is an imperishable intellectual elite that will not be humiliated and dominated by the state, will always outsmart the state, and is fundamentally a force for liberty. That's what I've understood you to say. Will that force prevail in the end, or are we simply going to disappear as a lumpen proletariat of self-destructive idiots? Because I don't think that's the true spirit of men.
Well, I don't think you can ever count out the Americans. You know, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of them, right? 330 million. That's a lot of Americans. And it's a very politically diverse country. And so no matter how many Americans are going insane at once, there's some somewhere beetling away on something sane and revolutionary. And we've seen that time and again. Anybody here who's like 50 or older, you see the Americans, they keep reinventing themselves. People count them out constantly. The Japanese are going to take over. It's like, well, they didn't. And neither did the Chinese. You can't count out the Yankees, no matter how much you'd like to. And I see the same thing when I travel through the States now. You know, there's plenty of places that are just as pathetic as Toronto in the United States. Most of California, New York's pretty damn dismal. There's Washington, God, masks everywhere. It's just pathetic. But there are places where that's just not the case. And lots of places in the US are flourishing like mad. A lot of the small cities, Milwaukee looks great. Nashville's just a happening place, as is Tennessee, weirdly enough. In general, Florida seems to be like a bastion of freedom, and DeSantis is going to come storming out of there, I suspect, for the 2024 election. And so the political... The woke have not won a final victory in the United States, that's for sure. Now, Europe, well, the Eastern Europeans, there's lots of them, they're looking at the West thinking, I was in like 14 Eastern European countries earlier this year, and I met a lot of political and cultural leaders there, and some of them were conservative, some liberal, some disaffected leftists who'd been canceled. Thing about Eastern Europeans is that it wasn't that long ago that, you know, the Stasi was in their bedroom, and so they kind of remember that since it was only 1989, and even the bloody socialists there are smart enough to think that maybe they don't want that again. And so when I talked to all the Eastern European people I talked to, they said, what the hell's wrong with you people in the West? It's like, don't you see that you're being enticed by exactly the same ideas that just devastated our country? It was particularly poignant in Albania, because Albania had the distinction of being the worst rat hole of the Soviet rat holes, and that was a hard contest to win, man. And so you really had to work on your oppression to top that list. And I mean, the whole country is honeycombed by secret tunnels so that the Albanian elite could escape when the hordes who wanted everything Albania had to offer inevitably descended to take over the country. They bloody well believed that for like 40 years. It's really, they've uncovered a 110-room underground bunker within half a block of the parliament 5 years ago that no one even knew was there. And so going to those countries, all the people there, they think, we're not doing this. We're not walking down this pathway again. And so there's lots of people in Eastern Europe who are the staunch supporters of the closest thing to freedom that they've been able to dream up. And so we can't count them out yet. And so, you know, and maybe the Germans, didn't the Germans just build a liquid natural gas terminal in like 5 months, showing that Germans can still be Germans when it's necessary? And so we'll see. Europe, it's pretty sad in many ways to tour through Europe now, because I've met with a lot of people in Western European countries, and it's so strange for a Canadian to go to places like Amsterdam. I met with a group of cultural and political leaders a couple of times in Amsterdam, and one of the times they said, well, you know, we really don't have a culture. And I come from like Western Canada, right? My town was scraped out of the prairie like 50 years ago, and I go to Amsterdam, which is this stunning miracle of a city, and then I hear these Netherlanders who've scraped their bloody country out of the ocean and have produced this incredible mix of culture and architecture and art and freedom and stability in order to say, well, you know, we really don't have a culture. And I think, well, you should come to Alberta. So it's so sad, and you see the same thing in Scandinavia. You see the same thing in Germany. They're always flagellating themselves for one reason or another, and there's this complete collapse in belief in the core and remarkable doctrines of the free West, and that's just a complete bloody catastrophe, because insofar as the world isn't an absolute hellhole, and in many places it certainly is, the only reason for that is that miraculous burst of, what would you say, emphasis on human liberty that emerged out of the Middle East 3,000 years ago and has spread its way, thank God, across the West and to some degree into the rest of the world. Well, you know, that's a tough spirit to defeat in the long run. We'll see how much suffering we have to do in the short run while we sort ourselves out again. But fundamentally, I'm optimistic. And fundamentally, I'm optimistic, you know. I mean, I think...
You got it. Thank you very much, Jordan. The sign at the back there tells me, and I'm just following orders here, that the time is up. But, you know, Lyndon, I agree with you about the United States, by the way, and I have more reason to be skeptical about that country for obvious, well-known experiences than most people, but it is a country unlike any other in the history of the world, and there is nothing in the history of the world remotely like the rise of the U.S. from 2.5 million colonists and 750,000 slaves in just 2 long lifetimes to such a position of preeminence as the United States has had since World War II. And it's not going anywhere. It's a jungle, and it has the strength and the weakness of a jungle. And like all jungles, it's run by the 30-foot constricting snakes and the 700-pound cats. Which reminds me, Lyndon Johnson famously said, and it's still applicable, and you in effect said this, that conservatives can't speak and liberals can't count. I think we have all seen and heard once again why Jordan Peterson is, I believe, the successor to Rob Ford as the most famous Canadian in the world. Jordan, on behalf of all of us here, I thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you very much.
I shouldn't tell you this, but I'm going to anyways. So I was talking to my insane brother-in-law here, and I've been joking for the last 20 years that someone should shoot him, and he thinks that they should too, but he thinks another person like him would just pop up to replace him who would be more evil, so that would be a mistake. So I was talking to him about ChatGPT and about the things I was telling you on the AI front. And he's just developed a chip that's optimized for AI, and he told me about it about 2 months ago, and he said, you heard of the internet? And I said, yes, Jim, I've heard of the internet. I said, well, my chip's way more revolutionary than that. And he's designed all the chips in your iPhones, by the way, so this isn't a person to take lightly, and all the chips that Intel used. And then he went to AMD and made a bunch of chips that competed against his chips at Intel successfully, and then he went back to Intel and made a bunch of chips that competed against his AMD chips. This is Jim. And so he's been telling me what's been unfolding on the AI front. Jim Keller, you can see a podcast I did with him recently with Jonathan Pajot, where we were trying to sort out whether AI is the rough beast that's slouching towards Jerusalem. And so you can check that out. But he came up with a proposition for me based on this ChatGPT. He said his AI model's built to generate photorealistic movies in no time flat, including real-time video interfaces of a given person that are indistinguishable in voice and appearance from the person. So he said, why don't we build a replica of you and then train it on everything you've said and written, and then you can interview it on your YouTube channel. And I said, well, how long will that take? And he said, about 3 months. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. So, no, that was like last week. So anyways,